Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to the History Squad. Now, most people will have heard of that terrible disaster, the sinking of the ship RMS Titanic way back in 1912. Well, the medieval times had their own disaster in the year 1120, known as the White Ship Disaster. It was on a dark, calm night that England lost its future. You see, with the sinking of the White Ship, it wasn't just the sinking of a ship. It was the loss, the sinking of the hope of all England. But to understand why this tragedy mattered so much, we have to go back in time to the man who started it all, William, Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror. So we got to go back to 1066 with the Norman invasion of England, the Battle of Hastings, where that poor Saxon king Harold is said to have had an arrow through the eye. I doubt that myself. But the Normans now conquer England. William the Conqueror is crowned William I, King of England. And boy, do they conquer the realm. They crush it. But now William has a bit of an empire. He has Normandy, he has England. And this is the beginning of the trouble going all the way through history. That the Normans had 1 foot in Normandy, 1 foot in England. Now when William the Conqueror, dies in 1087, he has to divide his realm. So he gives his eldest son, Robert Curthose, Normandy. He's Duke of Normandy. Curthose. They called him that, short hose, because he had short legs. I love that. But then William Rufus was crowned William II, King of England. But the third son, Henry, has no land. He is given a couple of chests of silver. So the division splits the conqueror's land, but now he's setting the stage for trouble. So, as ever, the two older brothers fall out. It's a land dispute. But Henry, the third brother, who has no land, he manoeuvres himself between the two. He ends up, for a while, in the service of the King of France. He's awaiting his moment. But meanwhile, William Rufus, this King of England, his reign is terrible. He promotes his friends into his court. They are extremely violent, debauched, deeply unpopular, infamous for corruption and their brutality, violation of women. But the thing is, they never answered for any of their crimes. So when Rufus is killed in a hunting accident, things are going to change. But let me tell you about the hunting accident. It's said that a certain Walter Tyrrell shot the arrow and it must have ricocheted off a stag. He denies it, but anyway, this is how Rufus dies. The arrow hit him plumb center in the chest while he was on his horse. I understand that he dismounts, drops to his knees and snaps the arrow, then falls forward, driving the arrow into his body, killing him dead. So with the death of William Rufus, Henry has his chance. You see, Henry had been away for a little while from the hunting party down in the New Forest. His bowstring had snapped, just a mundane thing. He goes off to some peasant's cottage and they help him repair his bow. Just as he returns to the hunt, his brother is shot. William Rufus has the arrow straight through the chest. The body of this king, it's great the way they treat it. They throw a cloak over it and then they hog-tie it over a horse. And they now are going to walk back to Winchester. But Henry's not having any of it. He gallops ahead. He gallops straight for Winchester. This is the old capital of England, but most important, it's where the Norman treasury was. When he arrives there, he announces the death of his brother. There is some resistance, but he draws his sword and pushes aside this baron and claims the kingship for himself. Interestingly, now he is supported by the barons. They proclaim him as the new king because they are worried. You see, if a kingdom doesn't have a king, it's not a kingdom, is it? So Henry makes his way to London, where he is crowned King Henry I of England in Westminster Abbey. This makes him almost godlike, and it is legal. So it was difficult for Robert to challenge Henry's kingship of England because it was lawful. He'd been crowned in that Westminster Abbey. So, as ever, the two brothers fall out and they go to war. Now I'm going to cut a long story short. Henry gains control of Normandy. He's now King of England, Henry I, and he's master of Normandy. And it's just very interesting to note that this king, he liked law and order. He had great organisational skills, and he settled the land. England and Normandy began to operate as two halves of one kingdom. One thing about King Henry, was he hated dishonesty. So he kept a close eye on his sheriffs, the county sheriffs, the shire reeves as they were known, because every year they had to gather all the taxes up, bring it to London and account for their monies, their taxation. Now they had to go through the Exchequer, who was Roger of Salisbury, the king's auditor, quite a guy. Now the term Exchequer comes from a table. This apparently was Roger of Salisbury's idea. It's a 10-foot by 5-foot table with a 3-inch rim around it. But the tablecloth was made up of lots and lots of squares, hence chequer. And each square had a number on it, a figure, like it can go from a quarter of a penny to a pound, all the way to thousands of pounds. So these sheriffs had to ante up their taxes and make sure they hadn't been skimming off the top, because if they did, the Exchequer would find out, and boy, would they be in trouble. So with the help of his advisors, King Henry establishes England's administrative strength. But there was another side to this king. Although he was married to Queen Matilda and had 2 legitimate children, a son and a daughter, he was a randy devil. He had over 20 illegitimate children, at least 9 sons and 13 daughters. He recognized many of them, and he put them into positions of strength. It's like his little web all over Normandy, all over England. But the king's legitimate heir, William Athelin, now that is Saxon for Prince of the Royal Blood. The Normans, they called him William Adelin. Now, when Henry conquers Normandy, he puts his son in charge of Normandy. So William becomes Duke of Normandy, which is great because it means that his son can pay homage to the King of France for the Duchy of Normandy, so the King of England doesn't have to do it. England finally looks stable, and the dynasty of the king is secure. Now this all leads to the night of the tragedy. It takes us to the harbour of Barfleur in Normandy, November 1120. King Henry and William and much of the royal household and so many hangers-on are ready to sail back to England, homage having been paid to the King of France. Now 2 ships are available. King Henry chooses the traditional, more reliable ship. William is offered the White Ship. It's either a new ship or it's been refurbished, hence the name, the White Ship. Now, William's ship is packed with over 300 young nobles. 2 of them are Henry's illegitimate children, Richard of Lincoln and Matilda. They were cousins of the royal household, heirs of the great families, noble women, noble men. It was the place to be. It was a party ship. They were dressed in their fine silks, fur trim. They were showing off. And boy, were they drinking. In fact, there was that much raucous behaviour and so much drinking that Stephen of Blois, that's the grandson of William the Conqueror, decides he ain't going with these. It's too dangerous. He disembarks. He has it on his toes. You know, they even bought a couple of barrels of wine for the crew. So even before the ship set sail, the captain, Thomas Fitzstephen, and the helmsman and the other sailors and the royal guards apparently were drunk. Witnesses, they say, you could see everybody. They were having a right old time, lots of bravado. They were shouting, "Let's overtake the king's ship. We'll show him the White Ship." The king had set sail sensibly earlier on, but due to drunkenness and all the partying, the White Ship was late to set sail. But the sea was calm, and it was a moonless black night. The oarsmen now, they have to, I think there was 50 on board the ship, have to steer the ship clear of the harbour. But locals could hear the cheers, the singing. They could see the lights that had been lit on the stern of the ship. But before it left the harbour, they hoisted the mainsail. That's so dangerous. That's still within the harbour, and it accelerates the speed of the ship, and there were dangerous rocks ahead. Just outside the harbour, tragedy strikes. The ship hits the Killeberth rock. Huge tear down the hull. Water floods in immediately. And as you can see, I've actually made a model of the tragedy. So as you can see in my model, the ship has turned over. These are the rocks that it struck. You've got casualties here on the rocks. You've got people who've fallen into the sea. We've got one guy here clinging to life, an upturned lifeboat. I've tried to include everything, flotsam and jetsam, and of course the turbulent water as the ship is rolling over and taking so many of the passengers straight to the bottom. Imagine the scene: freezing black water and panic screams of those who were drowning. People on the shore heard the noise, but they assumed it was just a party still going on. William was placed aboard a small skiff, a lifeboat if you like, and he's rowed away to safety. But then he hears a familiar voice. It was his half-sister Matilda screaming out for him as she struggled in the water. So he ordered that the skiff be turned back and they rowed to the ship. But as they reached the wreck, they were swamped by terrified survivors desperate to climb aboard, and the little boat was dragged down beneath the icy water. Everyone aboard the white ship, over 300 people, were lost, except one. Berold the butcher from Rouen had survived, clinging to a mast or a piece of spar. He described how he saw nobles dressed in heavy cloaks and their fur and mail drowned. Berold was dressed in wool, maybe had some leather, so inside he would have been kept warm. He saw how those dressed in their silk, their finery, died of hypothermia clinging to the rocks. He said that the captain came over, swam over to him, but when he looked back at the terrible loss and the loss of the prince, the captain simply allowed himself, ashamed, to drop beneath the waves. Now the victims, well, there was William Adelin, heir to the throne, his half-sister Matilda, Countess of Perche. Some of Henry's other illegitimate children drowned, as well as many leading Norman and English noblemen and women, heirs to the great families. It was as if the political heart of England and Normandy had simply disappeared in the night. Back in England, King Henry arrives safe and sound and awaits the white ship's arrival. But of course, he doesn't turn up. Rumours spread. People are worried. Courtiers are frightened to tell the king. Not only that, they're full of their own heartbreak. So many of their young offspring were dead. Finally, a boy is persuaded to kneel before the king and tell the king the truth. Now, Henry dearly loved his son, and chroniclers say that once he received the news that his son was dead, he never smiled again. King Henry's wife, Matilda, died some time before, so now he decides to remarry, and he marries Adeliza of Louvain. They're hoping for a son and heir, but unfortunately they have no children. So Henry forces the nobles to accept his daughter, Matilda, as heir to the throne. But when he dies in 1135, his nephew, Stephen of Blois, seizes the throne, breaking the oath with the king. Now, I don't know if you remember Stephen of Blois. He was the guy who stepped off the drunken ship. Interesting point, eh? Now, because of Stephen seizing the throne, civil war erupts. There is anarchy. It lasts 1135 to 1153. It was described at the time as if Christ and his saints slept. It was brutal. A lawless era, as I say, lasted nearly 20 years. Eventually, the civil war between Matilda and Stephen ends, with Stephen being forced to recognise Matilda's son as the future King Henry II as heir to the throne. And so, the Plantagenet dynasty is born. Do you know, all sorts of theories abound about the White Ship. Some say it was sabotaged or part of a political plot. Interestingly, Stephen of Blois disembarked, didn't he? And people go, oh, why? However, at the time, there were no conspiracy theories. And these theories can very often overshadow the simple truth. You look at the Titanic on a dark, calm night. It hit an iceberg. Lots of conspiracy theories, but actually it was an accident. And likewise, the White Ship on a dark night in the English Channel was travelling too fast and it struck a rock and sank. It was one terrible accident that changed the whole kingdom of England and Normandy forever. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video of ours. If you did, like, share and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel further, why not have a look at joining our Patreon community? The link, it's in the description. Now, before I go any further, or before I go, I'd like to give a shout out to some of our Patreon members. We have Will Kunn, Johnny McDonald, and Mason Kinsey. Hey guys, thanks a million. Bye for now.